The summer sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the quiet suburban street. Birds chirped softly from the trees, and the faint sound of children laughing echoed from a few houses down. It was the kind of neighborhood where people smiled as they passed each other, but rarely stopped to talk. Life moved at its own unhurried pace, with everyone wrapped up in their own little world. But for one boy, everything was about to change in a way he never could have imagined. Ethan was 12 years old, the kind of kid who preferred riding his bike over staring at a screen. He had always been curious about people, especially the ones who seemed a little different. And no one stood out more than Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman who lived alone in the big house at the end of the street. Most of the neighbors knew little about her, except that she had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Some whispered that she was once a world traveler. Others claimed she was a retired professor. But as far as Ethan could tell, she was just lonely. It started with a simple hello. One day, as Ethan rode past her house, he saw her struggling to carry groceries inside. Without thinking, he jumped off his bike and rushed to help. "Oh, thank you, dear," she said, her voice warm but frail. Not many people stop by these days. That small moment turned into a habit. Every afternoon, Ethan would swing by after school, sometimes helping her with small tasks, other times just sitting on the porch, listening to her stories. Mrs. Thompson had a way of bringing the past to life. She told him about her childhood, her adventures in different countries, the love she had lost, and the dreams she had chased. Ethan hung on to every word. In return, he shared his own thoughts, his dreams of becoming an astronaut, his frustrations with school, and his hopes for the future. Slowly, an unlikely friendship blossomed between them. But as the seasons changed, so did Mrs. Thompson. Her steps became slower, her voice weaker. Some days, she wouldn't come outside at all. Ethan noticed, but he didn't ask questions. Instead, he just made sure to be there, keeping her company in whatever way she needed. Until one day, she wasn't there at all. The news spread quickly. Mrs. Thompson had passed away peacefully in her sleep. Ethan felt a deep sadness settle in his chest. She had become more than just a neighbor. She was a friend, a mentor, almost like family. For days, he sat on her empty porch, wishing for just one more story, one more afternoon together. But then, something unexpected happened. A few weeks after her passing, a man in a suit showed up at Ethan's house. He introduced himself as Mrs. Thompson's lawyer and handed Ethan's parents a letter. Confused, they opened it while Ethan watched, his heart pounding. The words inside changed everything. Mrs. Thompson had left something behind. But it wasn't just a small gift or a handwritten note. It was a secret, a life-changing one. Ethan had always known there was more to her than met the eye, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to discover. And in that moment, he realized he had only just begun to understand who Mrs. Thompson really was. Ethan's hands trembled as he watched his parents read the letter in silence. His mother's eyes widened, while his father let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. This can't be real," his mother whispered, glancing at the lawyer, but the man in the suit simply nodded. Ethan could barely breathe. What had Mrs. Thompson left behind? Was it a message? A keepsake? Maybe an old book with her favorite stories? He never expected what came next. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Thompson has left behind her entire estate." To Ethan, the words hung in the air like a thick fog, and for a moment, no one spoke. Ethan felt his stomach twist. "Her house?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just her house." The lawyer replied, Everything. The property, the savings, the investments. Mrs. Thompson was a millionaire. Ethan's head spun. A millionaire, the woman he had sat with on the porch, listening to her stories about a simple life, had been wealthy all along. It didn't make sense. She never dressed fancy, never showed off anything expensive. Her house, though large, was old and worn. She never talked about money, only about the people she had met, the places she had seen, the lessons she had learned. His parents were just as shocked. His father rubbed his temples, trying to process everything. Why would she leave it all? To Ethan, he muttered. She had no family. The lawyer sighed, adjusting his glasses. No living relatives. And as for why, well, that's something only she could answer. But there's more. Ethan's chest tightened. More. The lawyer handed over a small sealed envelope. She left this letter for you, Ethan. His fingers shook as he took it, the paper feeling heavier than it should have. Carefully, he opened the envelope and pulled out a handwritten note. Mrs. Thompson's familiar cursive filled the page. The ink slightly smudged in places. My dear Ethan, if you are reading this, then I have already left this world. But please know that meeting you was one of the greatest joys of my life. You reminded me of something I had long forgotten, what it felt like to truly connect with another person, to share stories, to laugh, to be seen. I never had children of my own, and over the years, as the world moved on, I found myself alone. But then, there you were, full of life, curiosity, and kindness. You never asked for anything in return, never expected anything beyond a simple conversation. And that, my dear boy, is a rare gift. I have no use for wealth anymore, but you do. This is my way of thanking you, of ensuring that you chase your dreams without worry. Use it wisely, Ethan. Follow your heart and never stop being the boy who saw an old woman, not as a stranger, but as a friend. With love, Mrs. Thompson. Tears blurred Ethan's vision as he finished reading. He clutched the letter to his chest, his mind racing with emotions he couldn't quite explain. Gratitude, sadness, confusion, but above all, an overwhelming sense of responsibility. What was he supposed to do with all of this? In the days that followed, news of Mrs. Thompson's fortune spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. People who had barely spoken to her were suddenly talking about her as if they had been close friends. Some claimed they had suspected she was wealthy all along. Others whispered that there must be more to the story. Why would she leave everything to a 12-year-old boy? Ethan hated the attention. He didn't want people looking at him differently. He didn't want to be the kid who inherited a fortune. He just wanted his friend back. But things only got stranger from there. One evening, as he sat on Mrs. Thompson's old porch swing, staring up at the house that now legally belonged to him, he noticed something odd, a faint flicker of light from one of the upstairs windows. The house had been empty for weeks. No one had gone inside since the day she passed. His parents had spoken to the lawyer about what to do with it. But for now, it remained untouched. So, who or what was inside? Heart pounding, Ethan stood up and slowly walked toward the front door. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He had been inside countless times before, but tonight something felt different. The air was heavier, the silence more intense. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The house smelled just like it always had. A mix of old books, lavender, and something warm and familiar. But there was a stillness now, an emptiness that made his chest ache. He stepped forward cautiously, his footsteps echoing through the quiet space. Then he heard it, a soft creak from upstairs. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure if he was more scared or curious, but either way, his feet moved. Before his brain could stop him, he climbed the staircase, each step slow and deliberate. When he reached the top, he turned toward the room where he had seen the light. Mrs. Thompson's study. The door was slightly open. Ethan swallowed hard and pushed it wider. The room was exactly as she had left it. Shelves filled with books, her favorite armchair by the window, a desk covered in papers, and old photographs. But one thing was different. On the desk, right in the center, was an envelope, a new one that hadn't been there before. His hands trembled as he picked it up. His name was written on the front, but the handwriting, it wasn't Mrs. Thompson's. Someone else had left this here. And suddenly, Ethan realized Mrs. Thompson's story wasn't over yet. Ethan's fingers tightened around the envelope as his heart pounded in his chest. Who had left this here? The house had been locked. No one had been inside. At least, no one was supposed to be. His mind raced with possibilities. But he knew there was only one way to get answers. He had to open it. Slowly, he peeled the envelope open and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The message was short, but it sent chills down his spine. You don't know the full story. Come to the greenhouse. Ethan's breath caught. The greenhouse. It was in the backyard, a place Mrs. Thompson rarely spoke about, overgrown with vines and dust-covered windows. It had always seemed forgotten, much like the rest of her past. He had never thought much of it, until now. Clutching the note, he hurried down the stairs and out the back door, his pulse quickening. With every step, the moon cast an eerie glow over the yard as he approached the greenhouse. Its glass panes cracked and fogged with age. He hesitated for just a moment before pushing the door open. Inside, the air smelled of earth and time. Dust particles floated in the dim light, and rows of empty plant pots lined the wooden shelves. But Ethan wasn't looking at the plants. His eyes landed on a small wooden box sitting in the center of an old work table. It hadn't been there before. With a deep breath, he stepped forward and lifted the lid. Inside there were letters, dozens of them, neatly stacked and bound together with a faded ribbon. Ethan carefully pulled one out and unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words. Dearest Margaret, it began. Margaret! That was Mrs. Thompson's first name. Someone had written to her. As Ethan continued reading, the truth slowly unraveled before him. The letters were from a man, someone who had loved her deeply. They spoke of dreams they had shared, a life they had planned, and a promise that had never been fulfilled. The words were filled with longing, regret, and a love that had never faded. Even as time pulled them apart, one letter stood out. It was dated decades ago, just before Mrs. Thompson had moved into the neighborhood. I waited for you at the station. I thought we would leave together, start our new life like we always planned. But you never came. I don't know why, and maybe I never will. But if you ever read this, know that I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. Ethan swallowed hard, his chest tightening. Mrs. Thompson had once had a great love, a love that she had lost. She had never spoken about it, never hinted at the life she had almost had. But it explained so much. Why she had never married, why she had lived alone all those years, why she had told Ethan, time and time again, to follow his heart, to never let life pass him by. Tears pricked his eyes as he gently placed the letter back in the box. He could almost picture her here, sitting at this very table, reading these words over and over again, holding on to a past that never let her go. And then he noticed something else. Beneath the letters, tucked at the very bottom of the box, was a small key. Ethan picked it up, his heart pounding again. He knew exactly where it belonged. Without hesitation, he ran back inside the house, up the stairs, and straight to Mrs. Thompson's bedroom. There in the corner stood an old wooden chest that had always remained locked. He had seen it countless times, but had never thought to ask about it. He slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly. The lid creaked as he lifted it, revealing what Mrs. Thompson had kept hidden for all these years. Photographs, letters, mementos of a life she had once dreamed of living. But among them, something stood out, a single envelope with Ethan's name on it. Hands shaking, he opened it. Ethan, it read, "If you've found this, then you've uncovered the truth I never had the courage to share. I spent a lifetime wondering about the choices I made, about the love I lost, about the what-ifs. But in my final years, you gave me something I never expected, a chance to feel young again, to remember what it meant to truly connect. You, my dear boy, were my greatest joy. And now I leave you with this. Do not live with regret. Chase your dreams. Love fearlessly. And never, ever wait too long to follow your heart. The world is yours, Ethan. Live it well." Ethan wiped his eyes, his heart aching in a way he had never felt before. Mrs. Thompson had given him more than just her fortune. She had given him a lesson, one that would stay with him for the rest of his life. As he stood there, holding the letter close, he realized that Mrs. Thompson's story wasn't just about wealth or secrets. It was about love, about time, about the things we leave behind, and the people who change us in ways we never expect. And in that moment, Ethan made a silent promise. He would live, truly live, for himself, for his dreams, and for Mrs. Thompson.